Good morning, children. How are you all? Hope you are all fine. Welcome to today's session number 3. Before entering into session number 3, let us have a recap of session number 2. So, what do we learn in session number 2? Flower. Structure of a flower, functions of flowers, types of flowers. What is a flower? Flower is the reproductive part of the plant and it is the modified shoot. Structure of a flower. Flower has 4 parts. Those are sepals, petals, stamen, and pistil. Sepals. Sepals are also called as calyx. They are green in color and they protect the flower during the bud stage. And the second part is petal. Petals are very colorful. They are also called as corolla and they are the attractive part of the flower. They attract the insects for pollination. The third part is stamen. Stamen is also called as androecium and this is the male reproductive part of the plant. And this stamen consists of 2 parts, that is filament and anther. Filament is a long tube-like structure and at its free end, it consists of a sac-like lobe structure, it is anther. And this anther contains the pollen grains and the pollen grains contains male gametes. And the fourth part is pistil and pistil is also called as gynoecium and this pistil consists of 1 or 2 carpels. And this carpel consists of 3 parts, that is ovary, style and stigma. Ovary is swollen part at the base of the carpel and it consists ovules and ovules contains female gametes. And style is the extension of the ovary. It is a long tube-like structure and at the end of this style, there is a disc-like structure called stigma and this stigma is sticky in nature and it receives the pollen during the pollination. And coming to the types of flowers. There are 2 types of flowers, that is bisexual flowers and unisexual flowers. Bisexual flowers means in these flowers 2 reproductive parts are present, means the pistil and the stamen are present in such kind of flowers. Those are bisexual flowers. And unisexual flowers means either the male part or female part are present in that unisexual flowers. And next is functions of flowers. Functions of flowers are pollination and fertilization. So in today's lesson, that is session number 3, we are going to learn about pollination, types of pollination, agents of pollination. Let us enter into our lesson. By the end of this class, you will be able to define pollination, differentiate between self-pollination and cross-pollination, understands the process of self-pollination and cross-pollination, list different types of pollinating agents. What is pollination? The process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same or another flower is called pollination. What is pollination? The process. Look at the picture, children, all of you, and observe the cursor. The process of pollen. Look at this pollen. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower is called pollination. What is pollination? The process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower is called pollination. Now there are 2 types of pollinations. What is that? Self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination examples are sunflower, orchids, pea. And cross-pollination examples are rose, hibiscus, jasmine. Let us learn in the next slide what is self-pollination. What is self-pollination? Self means in its own. In the same flower itself it happens. The process by which the pollen grains from the anther of a flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower or another flower in the same plant is called self-pollination. I repeat, children, look at the definition. The process by which the pollen grains from the anther of a flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower or another flower in the same plant is called self-pollination. Look at the picture, children. Here, the stamen are here and the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower in the same plant is called self-pollination. And this self-pollination takes place in bisexual flowers. This self-pollination takes place in bisexual flowers, and even it takes place in unisexual flowers where both the female and male flowers are born on the same plant. So examples are like sunflower, orchids, pea, and 4 o'clock plant. So let us look some more examples of the self-pollinated flowers. Look at the slide, children. This first picture is 4 o'clock plant. 4 o'clock plant means this flower blooms at 4 o'clock. So it is called as 4 o'clock plant. So this is a self-pollinated flower. And the next one is pea plant flower. This is also an example of self-pollinated flowers. And third one is orchids. And these are also self-pollinated flowers. Now let us see the cross-pollination. What is cross-pollination? The process by which the pollen grains from the anther of a flower of one plant are transferred to the stigma of a flower of another plant is called cross-pollination. I repeat, children, look at the definition, all of you, once again. The process by which the pollen grains from the anther of a flower of one plant are transferred to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same kind called cross-pollination. Look at the picture, children, all of you. Here, the pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same kind. That means the plant will be the same kind of the plant, but the flowers are different. Two different flowers, but the same kind of plant. It takes place both in unisexual and bisexual flowers. It takes place in flowers of different plants of the same kind of plant. So examples are rose, hibiscus, and jasmine. Now let us see the agents of pollination. What do you mean by agents of pollination? So this pollen should be carried by someone. So some animals are helping them in the pollination. So look at the pictures here, children. We have bees, butterflies, wasps, moths, beetles, birds, flies, bats. Even wind is also an agent of pollination, and sometimes human beings also helps in pollination. Let us learn in detail about the types of pollinating agents. Agents of pollination are basically divided into two types that are biotic agents and abiotic agents. Biotic agents are living organisms such as insects, birds, and animals comes under biotic agents. Abiotic agents means non-living things of nature are called as abiotic agents such as wind and water. Now let us learn in detail about these agents of pollination. Pollination by insects. How it happens, let us see. This pollination by insects occurs in plants that have brightly colored petals and fragrance. And these flowers produce a sweet liquid called nectar. Examples: rose, jasmine, marigold. See, children, these flowers produce brightly colored petals and a sweet smell. And usually these insects are in search of nectar, because nectar is the food for insects. So when they are in search of nectar, they visit from flower to flower. Let us see what happens when they visit from each flower. When an insect feeds on the nectar in a flower, some of the pollen grains get stuck to insect body, and when it visits another flower of the same kind, the pollen that are stuck to its body get rubbed off on the sticky stigma of flower, resulting in pollination. So when this insect feeds on the nectar of flower, some of the pollen grains stuck to its legs or its body. And when it visits to other flower, during that time, when it get rubbed off, the pollen get rubbed off and falls on the sticky stigma, which results in pollination. Let us see in this slide, children, how the pollinating agent is transferring the pollen from one flower to another flower. See here, these are the pollen grains, and the pollen is carried away by the bee, and the pollen stuck to its legs or its body, and when it comes and sits on this flower to feed the nectar, then the pollen drops on the stigma of the other flower. See, there are many pollinating agents like bees, butterflies, beetles, ants, wasps, flies, moths. All these are insects which helps in pollination. Now let us see the other pollinating agent. Pollination by wind. Wind is an abiotic agent. This pollination by wind occurs in flowers that are colorless, very small, without nectar and fragrance. These flowers are light, dry, and have smooth pollen grains. They produce large quantities of pollen to carry away by wind. See here, children, these wind pollinated flowers are very light and they are colorless and they don't have any smell, and even they don't produce the nectar, because they need not attract the insects because they are pollinated by wind. So they produce a large amount of pollen grain, and the pollen grain will be very light, which can be carried away by the wind. Let us see some flowers of wind pollinated. See here, these are some grasses which will be pollinated by wind, and this picture is of maize, and these are the female flowers. Let us see other pollinating agent in our next slide. Pollination by water. Water is an abiotic agent. Some water plants pollinate with the help of water. See here, children, examples of Vallisneria and Hydrilla. Both are the water plants, and these two water plants are submerged, means they are underwater plants. They are underwater plants, and the flowers are very small. These plants produce very small flowers with lots of pollen grain, and these plants will have a feathery stigmas to catch the pollen. Now the next pollinating agent, pollination by animals. It occurs in flowers that produce lot of nectar without fragrance. Flowers are brightly colored to attract the animals, such as birds and squirrels. See, children, here hummingbird and squirrel, both are pollinating agents, and this hummingbird is attracted to colorful petals like red and orange. And these flowers produce a lot of nectar, but they don't have any smell. Okay, let us see some other pollinating agents in our next slide. What do you see in this slide, children? This is a bat and this is a moth. Both are nocturnals. What do you mean by nocturnals, children? Nocturnals means they move during the night time. So night blooming flowers are white in color because they should be visible to these nocturnals, and these flowers will be pollinated by these bat and moth. and these flowers will have sweet fragrance to attract these animals. Okay? Now, why is pollination important? Pollination is important because it leads to fertilization and is also important in the formation of fruits and seeds. In our session number 4, we'll be going to learn what is fertilization and how the fruits and seeds are formed. Before going to terminology, let us see an animated video on types of pollination and pollinating agents.
Types of pollination. Objective: to learn the types of pollination. Pollination is the process during which the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of flowers. Pollination is essential in the production of fruit and seed. To understand the process, let's first look at the reproductive parts of a flower. A flower is made up of 4 concentric whorls: the calyx, the corolla, the androecium, and the gynoecium. The calyx is the outermost whorl and is made up of leaf-like structures called sepals. The next floral whorl, the corolla, is made of the familiar colorful, delicate structures called petals. It's this layer that attracts insects, such as bees, for the purpose of pollination. The plant's male reproductive organ is the androecium, which is comprised of stamens. Each stamen is a thin, long filament on which the anthers are present. These anthers contain pollen. As they mature, they will split open and release pollen grains into the air. The gynoecium or pistil is the flower's female reproductive organ. This organ contains the swollen ovary at the base, a long tubular structure known as the style, and a sticky tip called the stigma. Now that we know the basic parts that are involved, let's look at the types of pollination. The transfer of pollen grains from the stamen to the stigma of the same flower is known as self-pollination. The transfer of pollen from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another plant within the same species is known as cross-pollination. In flowers such as beans and tomato, pollination usually does not require pollinators or agents of pollination. Cross-pollination, on the other hand, requires pollinators such as a honey bee. When this little pollinator lands on a sunflower to gather nectar, its legs will be dusted with pollen grains. As the bee travels to another flower, it will leave behind some of the pollen when it stops, and this will be collected by the stigma. Eventually, the male pollen will unite with the female ovule during fertilization, and the ovule will become a seed. Besides insects, wind, water, and other animals such as bats also help in cross-pollination.
Hope you all have enjoyed the video, children. Now let us see the terminology. What is the terminology here? Pollination. What is this word? Pollination. Biotic. Biotic. Abiotic. Abiotic. Nectar. Nectar. Vallisneria. Vallisneria. Hydrilla. Hydrilla. Now let us see the summary of this session, children. First point is, pollination is the process by which pollen grains get transferred from the anther to the stigma. I repeat the point once again, children. Pollination is the process by which pollen grains get transferred from the anther to the stigma. Pollination is of 2 types, that is self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is the process by which the pollen grain from the anther of flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. Examples are pea plant, 4 o'clock plant, sunflower plant. The next point is cross-pollination is the process by which the pollen grains from the anther of a flower of one plant are transferred to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same species is called cross-pollination. I repeat, children, cross-pollination is the process by which the pollen grains from the anther of a flower of one plant are transferred to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same species is called cross-pollination. The process of pollination happens with the help of biotic and non-biotic pollinating agents. What are the biotic agents? Insects, birds, animals are biotic agents. Wind, water, or non-biotic pollinating. Hope you all understood this session, children. In this session, we have learned pollination, types of pollination, and pollinating agents, and why is pollination important. About this, we are going to learn in our fourth session.